A few weeks ago, I put out a tweet, and I'll put it up on the screen here in just a second. This was right after the Buffalo shooting, and I said, white supremacy is evil, and it is helpful for us to say so without qualification. This should be uncontroversial within the church, but unfortunately that cannot be assumed right now. And the kind of originating motive or thought behind that was just in the aftermath of the terrible shooting in Buffalo, and now here we are weeks later, there have been so many other terrible shootings as well. It's just horrible. But the thinking is, sometimes there can be a hesitation to speak in an unqualified way against white supremacy. And especially in conservative contexts, sometimes people can be a little bit shy or hesitant to do that. And that will always be kind of like, well, yeah, white supremacy is wrong, but like this. And I think that's unhelpful. And I'll say more about that in a second. But I've just been reflecting upon the reactions to the tweet. It got lots of positive reactions and lots of negative reactions. And it's just interesting. I've just been, you always want to try to understand where different people are coming from. And Jonathan Haidt has influenced me a lot in how to have conversations, how to try to understand. This happens for me a lot when I'm talking Protestant to Catholic or Protestant to Orthodox, or as a Christian talking with a non-Christian, where we have to realize that the other side will have different values underneath their concerns, and we can't see the values. So we have to listen very carefully to try to understand where they're coming from. So I've been just reflecting on some of the feedback, and I wanted to respond both to make some comments about the general state of dialogue on Twitter right now, but also specifically to respond on this issue, and I'll respond to 4 of the criticisms that the tweet got, because I think I'm not trying to be defensive in this, but after some time to work at it, think about it, get feedback, reflect upon it, I really think it could be helpful. And I've had some individual dialogues by email and phone with friends, and those have been productive. And I realize there's a lot of good faith people out there where we just disagree. Now, this video is not in response to bad faith critics. I did receive some pretty shocking stuff. I mean, people finding out what church I'm the pastor of, calling our church's, the church voicemail in the secretary's office and leaving these just terrible messages, people finding our church's Facebook page and questioning whether I'm a demon. It's like so silly, you just have to laugh at it. That's all you can do. People calling for my church to fire me because I'm a wolf in sheep's clothing, things like this. Now, there is that stuff out there, and most of the criticism is not like that. But there is a lot of bad faith criticism, and so I do block people on Twitter, not just to be mean, but because I think genuinely there's people, you sometimes get a feeling of where someone's coming at you. You realize no interaction will be productive. We just can't have a productive conversation. So blocking someone is the best thing to do for all parties concerned and just for the general state of our dialogue on Twitter. But there's a lot of good faith people out there who disagree with me on an issue like this, and it's tricky, and so I think we need to talk about these things. And so I thought I'd make a video about it because Twitter is very unhelpful to have any conversations like this on. It is, there's so many interesting dynamics on Twitter that are just so unpleasant and unproductive. I mean, one of the things I experienced is people interpret me as a part of a team and a side, and so they're quote tweeting it and saying, here's what they always say. And I'm like, who is they? I genuinely don't know what I'm being associated with. Or people read so much into what you say, they read you in light of a narrative that they have. And then obviously the big thing is Twitter tends towards snark and outrage. It rewards those kinds of responses. I read a study about this one time that different parts of the brain are accessed by Twitter than by long-form prose. So if you're reading the newspaper, one part of your brain is being accessed. If you're reading Twitter, another part is, and it rewards these kind of more emotive reactions. And so the dialogue just tends toward more and more and more escalation, and it's really unhealthy. And it also just makes everything so intense. People come across so intense on Twitter. You follow someone on Twitter and you think they're like this extremely strongly stated person, and then you meet them in real life and you go, oh, Twitter has this amplifying effect to how we come across. So, YouTube may not be ideal, but the best thing is face-to-face interactions, but it's certainly better than Twitter, I think, to try to talk about this and work on this a little bit and try to explain a little bit where I'm coming from to try to influence some others to maybe be a little more open to my concern about this, because I'm very concerned that with some of these responses. And so I'd like to try to speak into this sincerely out of trying to help the conversation move forward in a productive way. And I know that many good Christians out there will see this kind of issue differently than I do, but we can still talk about it, right? We can still work at it. We can still not close our hearts off to each other if we're able to try to make some progress in understanding one another and working at it. So I'd like to give a response to 4 of the most common criticisms. I'll just say them up front so you know where I'm going. The first is the criticism, name names. The second is the criticism that I'm maligning the church. The third is the criticism, what about other issues? That you're not talking about other issues enough. And the last has to do with the definition of white supremacy. So I'll take these one by one and let's work through them. And I welcome people. Any kind of good faith criticism is welcome. We can argue. Arguing is good. The things that happen on Twitter, the kind of immediate outrage and sarcasm, that's not helpful for us. So the first one is people are saying name names. This may have been the most common response. I think what's behind this is this feeling like this isn't a real issue. You can't actually identify any specific people who are white supremacists in the church. You're just kind of, and that relates to the second criticism I got, that I'm maligning the church. And so I heard many people say, I've lived in this conservative part of the country my whole life, and I've never met a white supremacist. Heard that from a lot of people. Heard lots of people saying, oh, surely if there is white supremacy in the church, it would be immediately called out. Things like this. And I would like to speak into this a little bit, not as an expert. I'm very much not an expert on these topics. It's not my area of academic training. I'm a learner. I'm studying. I think I mentioned in my tweets that I've made a personal vow before the Lord to never shy away for reason of cowardice from speaking about 2 issues of a social nature, abortion and racism. And I'm passionately convinced of the importance of those issues, and I think there can be pressures and temptations in various ways to kind of shy away from talking about them. And so those are not the only important issues, obviously, but they're 2 issues that I've personally felt drawn to invest in and kind of lean in on. So I've been reading, learning, trying to study issues of race and just better my understanding to come up to basic competency on an issue like this. And one of the things that you quickly start to see in studying issues of race in the United States is that the problem is not just overt, explicit advocacy for racism. In fact, that's just a tiny piece of the problem. It's way bigger than that. Okay, and so I would like to appeal to other white evangelical Christians especially to be a little more open to consider that there's more problems here than just if we have, though we do have that as well, actually. But this is one of the things that comes up over and over in the literature as you start to see, and it has a lot of plausibility. Racism is not just the kind of thing that's immediately identifiable and obvious to everyone. And as soon as you start to think about that, that's sort of obvious, right? Especially for the majority group, so white people in our context. It's very easy to be undersensitive to or naive about how racism works. I can already feel people getting defensive out there. Please just hear me. Consider this. We shouldn't get defensive about this. We should be open to consider this. Think about how any other area of life, if you have always been wealthy and you've never lacked for anything materially, it's harder for you to have an acute sensitivity to how poverty works and what that feels like and how hard that can be to get out of. If you've never lost a loved one that is close to you, it's harder for you to understand how grief works and how you talk to someone when they've lost someone and that kind of thing. In any area of life, it's like this. The problem is never just explicit affirmation of the opposing ideology. Think of any other issue that you do care about. Pick any issue, any justice issue that you care about. If you're a conservative person, pick some issue that you are deeply concerned about. Is the only problem for that issue those who explicitly oppose you? Absolutely not. So many times it's the silence of your friends, not the attacks of your enemy, that are going to be a challenge. And on the issue of race, there are a couple things. Number one is we can't rely on our own anecdotal observations. You can't just say, well, I've never met somebody, so therefore it can't be a problem. That may not give you the full picture of all that is out there. Second of all, when we're talking about issues plaguing the church like this, we're not just talking about things that are being explicitly endorsed from pulpits, though that we'll talk about that. That can happen. But we're talking a lot more of just what happens at the lay level, at the pew level. So the idea name names, we're talking about non-famous people for the most part. So how inappropriate would it be for me to name names and say like, oh, this guy over here, here's his name, and then people are going to start looking him up, and nobody knows who he is until then. That's not an appropriate way to address something. You don't want to put someone out in public like that. But if you want to, and then the other thing, the main thing is just the biggest problems with respect to racism are not just advocacy for racism. Oftentimes it will be a minimizing of it or silence about it. And so let me give some examples of where if the concern here is this isn't a real issue, people are saying name names, it's not really out there. There's no problem like this. Let me speak to that and try to clarify why I'm firmly persuaded that it is a problem and that it's entirely appropriate for us to speak to it. In some of my response tweets, I mentioned Tucker Carlson as an example of a political commentator who influences many churchgoers, and he's an example of the kind of person who does downplay the problem of white supremacy. He says white supremacy is not a real problem in America. He says something like, I'll get his exact words so nobody says I'm mischaracterizing him. He says he says white supremacy is not a real problem in America. The combined membership of every white supremacist organization in this country would be able to fit inside a college football stadium. And then he says, of the idea that white supremacy is a problem, this is a hoax, and it's a conspiracy theory. Okay, those are his terms. Now, however you want to try to qualify that or defend him in some way, it is not hard to imagine lay Christians imbibing this rhetoric and thinking, okay, yeah, white supremacy is a hoax. It's a conspiracy in the sense that it's not a real problem. It's not an actual live problem. And therefore, now how are they going to respond when their pastor addresses white supremacy? This is something I see happen. I have heard so many stories of this. For people who don't think this is a real issue, I can tell you so many, and I'm not going to name names because I don't want to publicly put these pastors out there. They're not already famous pastors. That wouldn't be fair to them to but I do hear stories regularly of pastors who speak out on an issue of race, and people leave their church. They receive pushback from people in the church, sometimes extremely ungracious, vitriolic pushback. And this is a real thing. This does happen. And I truly can't understand this sentiment of name names as though this weren't a real problem. The other way you could just know that for sure is just look at the polls. Don't rely on your anecdotal observations of what you see. Look at the polls. In 2017, and I'll put this poll up in the video description for anyone who would like to interrogate it. By the way, whenever I mention polls, there's always going to be people who say, oh, well, that's just a liberal bias or something like this. If you study a poll and are truly convinced, or a survey, that it results from a bias, fine, have reasons, but don't assume that just because you don't like what it results in. And man, people dismiss polls and surveys that they don't like, and that's a problem. So after the Charlottesville events in 2017, there was a poll conducted by ABC / The Washington Post. And the question was, do you think it's acceptable or unacceptable to hold neo-Nazi or white supremacist views? And 9% said it was acceptable. That's just one example. I was just researching this morning about this. We could stack up a lot more things like that. And unfortunately, hate crimes and hate ideologies do seem to be on the rise of all kinds, on the right and the left. That's a real thing. This is not some phantom issue. This is a real problem, and it's entirely appropriate, necessary, and godly for Christians to say this is wrong and to call for unqualified opposition to this. The second criticism I got is that I'm maligning the church. Now, trying to understand this one, I do appreciate how people might be feeling. A lot of people are just feeling beat up. I preached a sermon the other week on the Great Commission, and the idea of the sermon was, when it feels like your team is losing. And I was talking about how all authority has been given to Christ, so we can take consolation in that. And I was talking about how a lot of Christians feel like their back is to the wall right now. I can understand those feelings, and I can appreciate the fact that sometimes criticism of the church is a maligning of the church, or as others put it, a slandering of the bride of Christ. But my response to this would essentially be to say, now here's the problem. When we make a distinction between criticism of the church that's legitimate and godly and criticism of the church that's illegitimate and ungodly, and we appeal to examples of godly criticism of the church, such as the Old Testament prophets or the reformers, immediately the avalanche of snark and outrage engulfs you to say, you're comparing yourself to a modern-day prophet or a modern-day reformer. No, we are not. We are simply establishing the principle that you can criticize the church because you love the church, and sometimes it is even necessary to do so. And some people were saying that my tweet was partisan because I'm only speaking to some issues and not others. I actually think this response is partisan because nobody says you're maligning the church when you criticize other errors on the other side. If you're talking about a liberal error or an erosion of theological fidelity or something like this, and you criticize this and express concern about this, no one says you're maligning the church. Criticism can come from a heart of love. If you're on a boat and you see an iceberg ahead, and the captain of the boat is not turning the boat, you criticize the captain because you love the people on the boat. That's not maligning the boat or the other passengers, or even the captain. It's done out of love. And I think where we do see an uptick of more angry fundamentalism within the church, it's appropriate and godly and good and an expression of love for the church and for Christ to speak against that. We always need to be open to how we can do it better, and we always need to be fair to speak against other issues as well, but we should speak against sin and ungodliness wherever it is found. And that's the thing about third wayism, which people are talking about right now. It does not mean you're sliced down the middle, okay? What it means is the values of the kingdom of God are not wholly identifiable with any human ideology or political party. So wherever you're at, sometime or another, some parties might be closer than others, of course. You're not always going to be right in the middle or aloof. What it means is when there's friction between the values of the kingdom of God and the values of some political party or human ideology, you are always willing to criticize the human in light of the divine, in light of the kingdom values. And that does get you into trouble. But we have to do that. We have to do that. Let me address a third criticism that is related to what I just said, and that is that I don't talk about other issues enough, or you're speaking about this topic, that you talk about the Buffalo shooting, but you never talk about this other thing, or something like this. Now, in some respects, this feels like I'm being put into a narrative, because the fact is I do talk about other issues. I do get criticism from the other side. I mentioned abortion as an issue that I've made the same commitment on, and I do speak about that. And I do get criticism from friends who have changed their views on questions of human sexuality. And so I maintain a traditional view of human sexuality as between only permissible in marriage between one man and one woman. I have friends who, think of me as bigoted and so forth. So I never really know that these criticisms sometimes they're assuming that, we know exactly when he talks about things based upon Twitter, maybe. But even on Twitter, I talk about those things. So I don't really feel that those are fair. But I do think that this is often whataboutism, which is one of the things I was speaking against. When we say we should condemn something without qualification, part of what is helpful is to say white supremacy is wrong and not feel the need to add on but some other thing is also wrong. That's not helpful to require that in every time you condemn one issue, because these issues are not in competition with each other. Biblical righteousness will cause us to speak in different directions and different issues at different times, and righteousness is consistent. So we shouldn't ever give the idea that there's competition. Like if you talk about one thing, then you have to immediately always talk about another thing. Now, if someone says, yeah, but over the whole course of your ministry, you only talk about issues on this side or something like that, or some people were saying that which is not true of me. But some people were saying, well, you talked about Buffalo, but not this other violent event, or you talk about white supremacy, but not black supremacy, okay? Now, I stand opposed to all violence and all racism, and I fully condemn it all. But the reason why sometimes it will be appropriate to speak against something like white supremacy is because there may be a greater temptation for the people under your pastoral care or in your circle of influence toward that sin than another sin like the sin of black supremacy. I don't really know as many Christians who are tempted to that or tempted to be silent about that as I do on this issue, which I think has been far greater in light of our national history. So, how do I say this? There's a principle that I want to introduce into these conversations that I think is lacking in this more conservative wing that is emerging within evangelicalism that is very, the kinds of people who are very critical of my tweet. And the principle is that Christians are held to a higher standard, okay? Let me read from 1 Corinthians 5. I think this is very relevant to these conversations. Paul writes in verse 9, I wrote to you in my letter, I'll put this up on the screen too, not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from among you. This is a principle we see many passages in the New Testament. 1 Peter 4:17, for it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God, and if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? Now, we should speak out against the sins of the culture. But nonetheless, there's a distinction we can make here. We don't have the same level of responsibility for those outside the church. There's a sense in which God is going to deal with them, and we need to warn them about that and invite them to come into Christ and experience salvation. But we don't bear the same responsibility for them. Paul makes that very clear. The people that you're supposed to stop associating with are the people who claim the name of Christ and yet engage in these various sinful behaviors. And so there's a principle there that sometimes we have a greater responsibility to speak to the sins that are affecting the church. I think that principle is really lacking in some of these discussions, and I think it'd be helpful to draw that into greater visibility. Okay, finishing off here, the fourth criticism I got a lot, not a lot actually, a couple people, was about the definition of white supremacy. And I think the idea here is that I'm assuming one definition, but what about all these other definitions and that kind of thing? And there's a validity to that concern. So let me speak to this in this way. Here's how my dictionary defines white supremacy. Merriam-Webster says, white supremacy is the belief that the white race is inherently superior to other races and that white people should have control over people of other races. In scouring around, I find that definition is not eccentric. Okay, it fits with the words as well. And this is what you pretty much find in the dictionary. White supremacy. White people are superior to non-white people. Okay, that's a basic dictionary definition, which is very common. And of course, my tweet was occasioned by the Buffalo shooting, and the manifesto put out by the shooter was not giving this highly nuanced academic understanding of white supremacy. He was articulating ideas that are racist. Now, it is true that in academic contexts, there's these more expansive construals of what white supremacy entails. And so it gets into kind of broader structures of privilege and superiority and that kind of thing. And I do agree we need to be very clear about what we're talking about and define our terms. And so when there's any ambiguity, clarify. What do you mean by this? And then we argue about that. And I do think we need to be discerning about different definitions that may be assumed at times and put out there. But, all we need to do there is just clarify that. When we're in a dialogue with someone, ask them, what do you mean by this? Right there in the moment, we can clarify that. Or if we feel that it's being defined unfairly, push back against that. But my concern is that people sometimes use these more nuanced academic discussions about more sort of expansive usage of the term white supremacy as a way to evade what we need to do with the basic dictionary definition of the word, okay? And that is a blunt condemnation, because white supremacy is evil. It is contrary to the image of God in us, and it is necessary for us to say so. The other response I got a little bit is, so my response to that fourth thing is, yeah, let's talk about the different definitions and work at them, but not at the expense of being clear about the dictionary definition. The other response I got a little bit is people with sarcastic responses saying, oh, what courage it takes to denounce this. And there really is a naivety about how the sociological pressures work. A lot of people have the idea that because the overarching narrative and the overarching trajectory of our culture in many respects is trending in a more secularizing direction, that therefore that's the only sociological pressure that can cause us to have courage in standing against it. But there's lots of subcultures. And a lot of times Christians, especially pastors, find themselves in a culture in which there is a need. I didn't feel like I needed courage in my tweet. It's a tweet, I'm aware I'll get blowback for it, of course. I was surprised at how nasty some of it was. But I'm not talking about myself, but I'm saying pastors often do need courage. There often is a need for courage to speak out against white supremacy and other issues of racism. It does take courage. And I think there's a naivety about how the sociological pressures work, and assuming that the kind of dominant pressure is the only one upon us, and not being aware of how it plays out within the subcultures. So those are my appeals. I offer those in sincere hope for good faith critics extending and furthering our dialogue. And to that end, I welcome your feedback and your response. You want to write a response or you want to leave comments, I welcome that. I think if it's done in good faith, we need to talk about these things. We can't just stop talking about these things. They're too important for the church at this time of terrible polarization. So I'll just conclude by expressing my hope and desire for the church not to continue to fracture as we are, but to talk through our differences in a charitable way, listen to the other side, and then follow our conscience as the Holy Spirit directs us. And that's what I'm seeking to do. I'm trying to follow my conscience because I believe we do need to talk about these issues. And as I say, I don't speak mainly about cultural issues. Most of my work is done to defend Protestantism and to defend theism and Christianity. And then to do work in like theological retrieval, theological triage, things like this. I'll do a series of videos this summer on theological triage. But there are some cultural issues where I feel as though I would be violating my conscience if I didn't speak to them. And so it's absolutely essential. One of the most sacred things in all of life is to follow your conscience no matter what. And that's what I'm committed to doing. But I also know that other Christians have their consciences directing them in a little different way. And that's where, again, I'm saying we just need to keep talking and working at these things. So hopefully that will be helpful for good faith critics, bad faith critics. I don't think about bad faith critics a lot, but I don't engage them either just because I don't think it's productive. All right. Thanks for watching this. May the Lord bless you.